Growing up, my brother and I loved reading the comics, and every day we'd race to get the newspaper. But on one snowy winter morning, when I was 10 years old, I saw something outside that left me speechless. As my brother and I opened the front door, there in front of us was a burnt, blackened cross stuck in the white snow. At 10, I'd experienced plenty of racial teasing. People pulling their eyes back, speaking in fake accents, calling me names. But this time, it was different. I knew that a burnt cross meant something more. But as Asian Americans, I never thought it would happen to me and my family. What I now know is that we experienced racial trauma, the psychological and physical stress that follows experiences of discrimination and racism. How families respond to racial trauma is critically important, not only to their health and well-being, but also to how we can address racism in our communities and in our nation. But in the winter of 1979, my family did not know how to respond. When people experience discrimination and racism, many of us are taught at a young age to be silent. We're taught to ignore or excuse the behavior. But these are not effective coping or parenting strategies. Silence is not the answer. I know this because for the past 25 years, I've researched how minoritized youth and families are affected by and respond to racial trauma. From these studies, I've learned that parents and children often struggle to address these issues. For instance, in a study of white adoptive parents raising Korean American children, we found that 4 out of 5 families could not have constructive conversations about racial and ethnic differences in their families. In another study of Asian American parents, 2 out of 3 parents were not able to have conversations about racism with their children. Too often, families, intentionally or not, silence these conversations. And this was true in our family as well. When my brother and I saw the burnt cross in the yard, we went and told our father, who was getting ready for work. What I remember is that he went outside, pulled up the cross, broke up the wood, and put it in the garage. He never said anything about it except something like, "Stupid people." No one in our family ever talked about that event again. It was the loudest silence in my life. This is how racial trauma often plays out. We stay silent. But racial trauma gets imprinted on us, manifesting as physical and mental health problems throughout our lives. It affects not only our well-being, but also our relationships and the life choices that we make. For me, I started to believe that my memory was a dream. I started to doubt my memory. No one was there to validate my experiences or help me make sense out of them. But people will try to make sense out of their traumatic experiences. For some, it'll lead them to identify more strongly with their racial and ethnic groups, and for others, it'll lead them away. And this is what happened to my brother and me. We took different paths in life. In high school, I struggled with feeling racially different from my peers, and over time, I started to rebel at home and at school. Eventually, it led to the point where I was asked not to return to my high school. But over the next few years, I found people in my life who helped me develop racial awareness and pride and a sense of belonging as an Asian American. My brother, by contrast, worked hard to assimilate into whiteness, and he never talked about race and distanced himself from our family and the Asian American community. He also struggled with depression and later in life attempted suicide after high school. Looking back now, I can see how racial trauma and the silence that followed almost killed him. And we now know from decades of research that racism, when it's not directly addressed, can shorten our lifespans, including by suicide. But why is it so hard for families, regardless of race, to talk about these things? Part of the problem is that we don't have what psychologists call racial literacy, or a way to talk about racism. Without racial literacy, parents often feel uncomfortable talking about these issues. And over time, parents and children learn to avoid bringing up these topics. Another part of the problem is that parents overestimate how much and how well they talk about these issues with their children. But our research has found that children actually want to have more of these conversations with their parents. What we need is radical change. We need to share our stories and experiences and learn from them. My brother and I didn't talk about that burnt cross for more than 30 years. And then one evening, as we were sitting in my Minneapolis backyard, I asked him if he remembered that snowy winter morning. Of course, he replied, and vividly shared the exact same memories. Except he remembered our father saying, "Bad people, bad people." I told him I had started to believe it was a dream, that I had made it up. And it took over 30 years before my memory was validated, for the silence to be broken and for the healing to begin. So how do we develop racial literacy and constructively engage in these conversations? When parents hear inappropriate comments or see racist behaviors, they need to break the silence. Talking about racism demystifies it. It makes it less something to fear and more something that we can address. And there's never a perfect time. It needs to just be part of our daily conversation, not only when bad things happen. Parents also ask me what to say to their children. And I tell them, start by using words that your children understand, but also introduce them to new words, expand their vocabulary, and share your own struggles and confusions. Even if you stumble with your words, it's better to try 100 times and get it right once than to never try and stay silent. Your children will remember that one time you got it right. And over time, those conversations add up. We found in a study that youth whose parents took the time during adolescence to prepare their children for discrimination and racism reported fewer mental health problems when they encountered discrimination as young adults. Talking with your child about racism when they're 16 or 18 helps when they encounter it at 22 or 24. What we do and say now makes a difference years later. When parents don't create space for racial conversations, children then are left on their own to make sense out of it all. And by adolescence, many realize that this is not something their parents can handle. And so they simply stop bringing up the issue. But parents, ironically, are often waiting for their children to bring up the issue first. Amplifying the silence comes at the expense of our health and wellness. Looking back in my life, I now know that my parents didn't realize the racial trauma we had experienced. They didn't realize how the loud silence left us confused and unsure how to respond. And this is not an uncommon situation, especially for immigrant families. But we can and know how to do better. We just need to be motivated to make change. We need to find a compelling reason to change. And my journey toward radical change began over 25 years ago. A mentor explained to me why my parents remained silent and what that silence meant. He shared that my parents' generation boiled inside with anger and frustration because they experienced discrimination on a daily basis. But they couldn't fight back. They stayed silent. They put their heads down and they worked hard. They toiled in the fields, in factory jobs, in restaurants, in the back rooms of offices. Indeed, I rarely, if ever, heard my parents complain. But then he shared. He said, "But your generation, this generation, has the King's English on your tongue. Your parents didn't sacrifice and endure just so you can be successful, but so that you could fight for them and yourselves. Speak for them." That conversation changed how I understood my parents and their experiences with racism. When my father said to my brother and me, "bad people," he was quietly expressing his hurt, his rage, his helplessness. And in his own way, he was trying to have a conversation with us. But none of us had the racial literacy to make sense of it all. Even though it took my brother and me more than 30 years to have our conversation, that conversation has drawn our life paths closer together. Now in our 50s, we collaborate on a daily comic strip, The Other Ones by Lee. And using our childhood love of comics, we give voice to the experiences of kids of color, using the King's English to speak for families like our own. And it's our hope that our comic will help parents and children develop racial literacy, because we need open and honest conversations so that we can heal from racial trauma. You see, racism wants to break us down, so we can't heal. But healing in the midst of racism is the most radical thing ever.